Hey readers, I'm Leandra.
And I'm Danny, and we are not reading for content.
This is a monthly book club podcast dedicated to reading in depth and leaving no plot point unturned. Each month, we read one book over the course of 3 episodes, basically reading 1/3 of the book at a time. Feel free to listen along, or better yet, read the book with us. Our first season of the book club has the theme of genre blends. A list of books and the club schedule will be in the description.
Welcome back to another episode of Not Reading for Content. We are so happy to have you here for our final discussion of the Day of the Triffids. We are going to be reading the last 6 chapters. We're reading from and further on to the end, and we're going to be discussing what happens in those chapters today. But before we do that, we need to do our bookish bite of the week. So, Leandra, do you have a question for us this week?
Oh, I do. And this one is in regards to endings. So, what elements do we require for a good ending? What are some elements that maybe we find dissatisfying? Do we like epilogues? Do we need all of the answers? Danny, what do you think about endings and what's your ideal ending?
That's a difficult question too, because I feel like it depends on the book and it depends on how everything is written. Because some of my favorite endings have been ambiguous and where it kind of leaves things to the reader to make up, their own minds about what happens. But I think that those are very few and far between. So probably my preference, the like safe zone for me for an ending, I do think I need most of the information wrapped up and discussed with the reader. Um, yeah, so I don't need everything tied up in a nice pretty bow, but I would say the majority of the storyline for it to be a safe ending needs to be explained and expanded upon. Epilogues don't bother me. I do think that in certain books they're unnecessary, and in others I would say I want more. But usually the ones that I want more, I think it's because the author didn't take long enough with the ending. We discussed this a little bit with the Cautious Traveler's Guide to the Wastelands, which the ending of that book was the disappointing aspect for me. I know you really enjoy that ending, but I thought that
Mhm.
the author could have really spent more time with some of the elements at the end of that book. And I would have liked to have seen an epilogue there. So it was really because I didn't get a lot of the answers that I wanted an epilogue. What about you?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because I've realized that while I do want a satisfying close to, the experiences that the characters have had, the conflict, the resolution, I do love an ambiguous ending. I really enjoy when the author is just trusting us to, imagine what could be moving forward. And sometimes it's because the author is providing nuggets where they're not saying it point blank. This is what is happening to them in the end. But there are up for interpretations. I admit that sometimes if an ending is ambiguous, I will argue that's because the author wrote themselves into a corner and they didn't really know what to do next. And so they just were like, I don't know. I don't know what happened. And it's like, okay, well, that's actually a critique on you. With epilogues, I get them. Sometimes they're, really nice to have a little bit of an extra bite to see what happens. But I think more often than not, 99% of the time, the epilogue isn't necessary. It's just like a nice extra thing. Most people don't have to read them. I've heard a lot of criticisms in the romance community that sometimes authors will give multiple epilogues, which I think is crazy because in like especially with romances, if it is that kind of traditional happily ever after, they're happy, they're together forever. Like what why do you need an epilogue? We already know. So sometimes I think authors do hit us over the head with trying to tie every little thing up rather than just trusting us to know that that's what happened. So for me, I don't mind not having all of the answers as long as we have most of like the kind of the answers that are important to me, which is of course subjective, right? There are
Yeah.
times when an ending is perfect for someone else because they got the answers they wanted, but the questions I had weren't answered. So maybe that's why I'm upset with, a certain ending. I also feel as though we differ because I would argue that my expectations for the ending in a standalone is different from my expectations with an ending for, books within a series. And I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on that. So with a standalone, because it's a standalone, I feel as though that probably is the section where we need the most answers, but I also kind of accept that it is ambiguous. The author is not saying, okay, wait for book 2. It's like, no, you have to accept this ending. This is the only thing you're going to get. We do see authors once in a while saying, okay, fine, I'll give you another book. And, we can argue whether we enjoy that or not, and whether it's, purposeful and intentional on the author to do it. But with series, I would say I do give more grace to books that are a part of a series if they don't answer everything, because I'm expecting that that's part of the overarching, element to the world, to the overall conflict. A book that we both actually read together was The Vampire of King Street. That one, I'm expecting it to be a series because of how many unanswered elements were thrown in at the end. And if it's not, as someone who prefers standalones, I will be angry that this that the ending was the way it was, because it clearly is not a satisfying ending to a standalone book. I would accept introducing so many new characters and so many new ideas at the end if it's because the author is waiting to tie in book 2, 3, whatever the case is. So I think that, do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's hard to kind of, this is a messy subject that I have introduced. I accept that, but it is interesting.
Yeah, I think with series, I do think I give a little bit more grace, but I do think I am less merciful than you are when it comes to series and answering questions, mainly because I want I'm okay with an author introducing new topics throughout a series and not giving you all the answers at the end, as long as it's not too much. We've read certain series. City of Brass is one of the ones that comes to mind that I feel like throws so much at you in the first book and you get nothing at the end. And that frustrates me. And I know you also didn't enjoy that book, but I I'm very picky about I want within a series, I think I should be able to read the first book and be satisfied at the end. And then there should be, obviously, if you're writing a series, you want readers to be intrigued enough to pick up the second book. So you're going to have some strings that are still a little loose that people can continue on. But I think there should be an encapsulated story within book 1, and then we move on to book 2, and there's a through line, like if it's a trilogy, maybe there's a through line that doesn't end until the 3rd book, but each individual book has its own, individual story. I think that, City of Blades and City of Stairs, which is the Divine Cities series by Robert Jackson Bennett, I think has done that really well. Each book has its own mystery and its own city that you're in, and everything is wrapped up at the end, but all of it is this larger, grand political scene that you're also in. So that's kind of my thoughts on series. Standalones, a standalone should give me everything at the end, in my opinion.
Yeah, you know what? This is so funny because I do think that I'm coming from a perspective where, as a mystery reader, mysteries are very series heavy, right? A lot of times we end up following one detective, but because I know that mysteries are unique in that a lot of times you can read them out of order. You
Yeah,
can have a separate mystery and then move on, and it doesn't really impact the later mysteries going on. And so, because that is my own background for series, I think I've had to be a bit kinder to series outside of the mystery genre, because it's not like that. You literally have to read the books in order, which honestly for me is so tiring. I actually find that so annoying, that authors are forcing you to kind of follow through the motions. And I think that's why I give it more grace, because I'm like, not every genre is perfect like the mystery genre. That's all I can say. No, but I feel as though your criticisms actually, like, I definitely speak to me, because that's matching every expectation with the mystery genre. If a mystery ends up having, this overarching trilogy where the mystery doesn't end at the end of the first book, I am like, you are sacrilegious to all mystery writers. Like, you need to apologize to the mystery gods, because that's just not the way it's done. And so now that I've gotten more into one actually following series to their end, because like I said, I'm not someone who likes to be tied down. I feel like I've almost been trained to expect not everything to be tied in a bow, because the mystery genre with series, everything has to be tied in at the end of the book, because there's nothing to continue on. You're starting with a new murder. You're starting with a new mystery, new suspects, everything starting fresh every single book. And
yeah.
so I think that. I might end up, obviously eventually having a similar feeling to you because, I'm newer to series and fantasy, sci-fi, and other things. But yeah, it is interesting. Yeah. I know that I always am nervous about recommending standalones to you, Danny, because I know that you like, because you're such a series reader, you always like end a book kind of wanting more.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting. Whereas I'm just like, I've been very well known for starting series that are meant to continue. Literally, you're supposed to read the entire thing, and I treat it as a standalone and I walk away. I'm like, that was a really great book. And sometimes I don't even know it's a series. There have been times where I've read a book and then years later I look back, I'm like, oh, that was a really good standalone. And then I realize it's like the first in 4 books. And I'm like, what? And I was like, well, I mean, you can read it alone, I guess, apparently, because we're fine.
You're a work in progress.
I'm trying. I'm trying to understand why series exist and how I can enjoy them.
Well, we should probably get started talking about the Day of the Triffids. We could talk about endings and the nuances of within writing and reading and things like that for days, but let us summarize the end of the Day of the Triffids. So, for those of you who are listening, if you have not read these chapters, this is going to spoil some things just to be aware. So, you might want to click away if you haven't read the end of the book yet. But just in a general summary for you all of the chapters that we're reading today or we're discussing today, we start with Bill and Coker, who are at Tensum, and they decide to move along and try and find Michael Beadley, who is the leader of the university group that we ran across in day two's reading. And they go on a search via multiple means, and they don't have much luck in finding Michael Beadley's group. The woman who was in charge at uh, Tensum ends up sending them in a direction that is not profitable for them. And Bill and Coker inevitably split up. Coker goes back to Tensum because he realizes that they're not going to have good luck surviving on their own. And Bill continues his search for Jocelyn and Michael Beadley's group. He does remember a conversation that he has with Jocelyn at the very beginning of the story about where she would go, um, and where she would find refuge if she had to. And so he ends up going there, finds her and some other people who are living on this farmstead that has its own well, its own electricity, and figures out how to live there. They kind of set up a homestead, a garden. They set up fences because they realize that the Triffids are coming out in force and are causing more and more problems. They have children. We have years that go by in these last few chapters, and it gets harder and harder and harder to live. And at the end of the book, we have Michael Beadley's group and another group come along and visit their homestead, and they have to make a decision of what to do.
Thank you so much for that summary. Now we can dig into the end of this book, our feelings, our reactions. But the first thing I actually want to touch upon is your mention that in this final third, years go by. And it's so interesting when we're really talking about the breaking up of the three sections we've read for this book, that we had one day, 10 days, and then years. It's just this crazy progression. I mean, I get it. I understand that it almost acts as uh, three experiences during a dystopian, collapse. So the day of the collapse, the very early aftermath during the chaos, and then years later where we've settled and this is our new reality. So I kind of get why it's like that. It's kind of interesting to reflect on that and say, wow, the pacing of this book has like slowed. And I think that we would probably agree that as we read, I felt as though the narrative got slower. It's not inherently a critique, but I do think that the first section was the most fast paced. Everything was new and shiny and, scary, which, of course I'm into. But it also was just faster paced because we're going through a much shorter timeline. And so as we got more settled in the narrative and these characters got more settled in their reality, it did feel as though the narrative pacing slowed down to match the timeline, which is something to kind of think about.
Yeah. I understand why the pacing went the way that it went and the timeline. I will say I was a bit disappointed. I would have preferred the first day, I was just very enamored, and I felt like I could feel what they were going through and empathize with everything that was happening, and as we cover more and more time with less and less pages, I feel like it disconnected me from the story a bit. And while it did allow us to see kind of where they headed and, the things that happened to them, and we still got to see some really small moments that were important. I feel like it took me out of the story a little because of how fast we were moving in time.
It could have been bettered or at least felt smoother if we had section breaks that provided time jumps so that the pacing remained consistent. But if the author really wanted to, he was dedicated to saying, okay, I want, from day one to the ending for it to span like 5, 6 years, something like that. Okay, fine, that makes sense. Again, allowing us to see the progression of this dystopian world. But not, it's okay to feel comfortable ending it saying, end of part one. And then part two is a couple years later, keeping that pace and then just having us play catch up. So that might have been better for what's going on because it did feel as though the author, rather than just having a quick time jump, he felt he had to summarize what was going on, what led them to that place. When I would have been completely fine with us suddenly being in a new location, saying, "So things have changed. Let's catch you up. This is what's happened, and now we can focus on like the highlights of what these characters are experiencing." Because there were a lot of downtime when I felt the author had to use a couple pages to set us up for the big scene he actually wanted us to see.
I do think we ended yesterday, or we not yesterday, we ended last week's conversation talking about how we thought maybe the ending was gonna go, and what I said that I didn't want to happen ended up happening, which was another disappointment of mine. I mean, not that I mind Bill and Josella ending up together. I That's completely fine, but I don't know. I think the timeline mixed in with some of the things that have happened, like the fact that he was calling her like sweetheart and darling when they met up at the homestead, I was like, I really don't like this. Like, I feel like you guys barely know each other, and I understand like they're it's in a dystopian society, and so they've been through hardships together and are going to have connections that other people don't have because of the things that they've seen together. But it just that was another thing that I think the timeline really didn't work well for me because of their relationship and how quickly it seemed to move, even though inevitably years had gone by, but it didn't feel that way on page, I guess.
Yeah, it does. One, it's very 1950s, which makes sense, of the time. I feel as though we saw a lot of books being published in the early 20th century where romances were very rapid. They happened very quickly, at least from my own experiences. And it also could be something that we could argue, which is interesting. This is again coming from like the academic brain, where I'm like, ooh, school discussion could commence from this. Is that in the collapse of society, it seems as though we have reverted back to very quick courtships, whereas in today's age, courtship could last months, years, until we even decide, okay, let's start a romantic relationship. And then that lasts years. So it is kind of interesting to consider this, where with, was it 99%? And that might be a generous thing of, people either becoming blind and eventually kind of dying out. And then you're like, this is what we have. These are our options. I also, feel as though there were some things that were completely glazed over in regards to their relationship and certain discussions they had. So remember when they were sitting on that bench on the university campus, and he asks Josala to have his children, very casual, and she says yes, but also I want you to have children with two other blind women. And it's like, okay, fine. Then when they end up getting together, they had this really kind of funny, awkward situation, like discussion. And I think it was the ending of a chapter when they, are, officially together. And they say, "Oh, remember, that discussion we had on that bench?" And he said, "Yeah, remember that one ultimatum you gave me?" And she's like, "Yep." And he's like, "I'm kind of glad I didn't have, I'm glad I didn't have to do it." And it's like, okay, whatever. And then when we bring back the Michael Beadley group, right? They're the ones who are in the end, the most successful, which we can also dig into because there are some things that are weird about that. Beadley's group realizes that they cannot sustain themselves by, protecting a compound on the mainland. It's too dangerous. There are too many Triffids around, and there's not enough like resources that they can maintain while defending themselves constantly. The amount of labor is just too intensive. So they go over to an island, and I knew that they were going to go and mention the Isle of Wight. And as soon as they did, I was like, "Yep, of course, of course, that's where they're going." And so they mentioned that this is in essence kind of the paradise of all the options. If you don't like what we do and what we say, there's another island group that you can go hang out with. But what I'm was waiting for is them addressing, so are you still ensuring that people practice polygamy? I mean, I don't know if anyone, they never directly said that they were going to be practicing polygamy. It was more Jocelyn assuming based off of very, obvious context clues. So I totally believed her assessment of the situation, but it's never mentioned. And I'm just like, are you practicing polygamy? I don't know why that's the thing I need confirmed, but they never mention it. And I'm just thinking, so your family, your little family is going to go over to this island, and then how is that going to go? What's happening? I suppose we're just assuming that they continue to survive and, defend their island. But I did feel like that was a bit weird because I'm like, remember when we were, well, at least you and I were skeptical about this situation with the Beadley crew. Another thing that didn't end up really being cleared up was this disease. I thought it was going to be more important or linked to the other issues going on in the world. And it was just a disease. There was nothing else to it, which was odd because I felt like it still impacted blind people more. I felt as though I
Yeah,
never really saw it impact the seeing people who
right.
avoided the quote unquote comets. But the assumption that Mrs. Durant died from it, who was also a seeing person, that that was weird to me.
Well, and I don't was it confirmed that she died from the disease or that she just said she would catch up with them later and then never did? So technically she could have died tracking to whatever facility they went to next. Like it was very her storyline ended very abruptly. I feel like that whole Tensum thing, like we lived there for a bit with Bill and Coker, and then when Coker went back, and then Bill decides whatever he's at the homestead with Jocelyn and the people that they're living there with, and he takes a trek out to Tensum to figure out if they can move their family, and he finds that it's been plague ridden. We didn't really get any answers. I mean, Coker says that certain things happened, but that kind of leads back to that could have been a lie, right? Coker is the one who's giving his reasoning for everything that happened, so he could have, I mean, this is like a super exaggeration, but he could have gone in there and murdered everybody and just said that the plague is the one that got them. Like, who knows what Coker ended up doing? So, yeah, I felt like that was very unexplained. And then I also felt like the Triffids, just in general, once again, in this section, felt very much like an afterthought until the very end where they started breaking down fences and becoming a huge nuisance for humankind. But we never have the question answered that the comments were caused by the Triffids or if they just decided to take advantage. There were, like, implications that, like, they just they decided to take advantage of our weakness at that time, and then there were other people who had different philosophies on what happened, but I don't feel like that was ever really answered either.
Yeah, I'm torn because I will say, I kind of get the fact that there aren't very many answers because in the
How
real
are they gonna
world, there
live in them?
wouldn't be. There
Right.
wouldn't be. Kind of similar to, it reminds me of Service Model a little bit, which is, a very odd comparison. But one of the characters in that book is constantly asking, what actually happened to humanity? Like, why did civilization collapse? Because realistically, most people in the world, if we ever have, a massive event that, obliterates society as we know it, most of us who survive would not understand what happened. We would have theories and maybe consider, but that it's only like a certain type of higher up person, and how convenient to follow a story who's that person would know what it is. So I have to acknowledge that I kind of get why various theories are being thrown about, and that there would be questions as far as, what, we have these questions, but in reality, what we need to focus on is actually surviving and, appreciating that we're able to live. So I can say I get that. And I do enjoy that to an extent. The theories that I thought were going about, there was also the mention of satellites.
Yeah.
There was this theory based on, like, Bill had this theory that a lot of the catastrophe was human made, which, honestly, preach. I mean, yes, yes, Bill, that's literally the best social commentary I could see. If it ends up literally just being humans being horrible to each other, because, I mean, we see it today, we've seen it throughout history. And he was definitely influenced by the fact that the Cold War was in, its beginning stages, fear of, the Russia, which, I mean, obviously that's where the Triffids came from. And then this mention of satellites watching each other, setting up, you know, little areas where you could probably like nuke someone and, get away with it, and just all of these threats going on. So you can see where he got that idea from, where what if we did set up these satellites that are able to attack from space? And what if something happened where the attack went wrong, and suddenly maybe we didn't realize how powerful our weapons were, which we've also seen that in World War II, with the atom bomb. So I can see where a lot of his influence comes from historical events and fears that were going on in the time, and I can definitely respect that. Obviously, the question too is like, how realistic is it? I mean, we're coming from a perspective in 2025, so we are in a better position than he likely was to know what makes sense and what doesn't. So I do kind of find that interesting. But there is also this question, a different theory that was dropped, I think, by Coker. Was it Coker? Someone else had mentioned that it seemed as though it was a bit convenient that these Triffids immediately acted, that
Yeah.
the day that all civilization collapsed, that's when they started to mobilize. And it could be linked to the fact that we also learn they can communicate, that them hitting their, so there could have been a situation where, while civilization was collapsing and all was quiet, these Triffids started talking, saying, hey, from a farther distance, are you also noticing that, things are amiss? Maybe this is our time to mobilize. So there are things that I can probably put two and two together and create, an explanation if I wanted to.
Yeah. Speaking of historical events, and just things that I found intriguing because at the time, whenever they were going around and seeing, whenever it was Bill and Coker were going around to find Michael Beadley's group, and they kept running into people, and there were so many people that were like, "Oh, the Americans will come and save us." And I
Yeah.
just, as an American, I was like, "This is weird."
Well, as an American, I was like, no, we're not. But you know what it is I do see the influence of, with like World War I and World War II, the US was in like a very strategic place unintentionally. It's not like we did anything. We just happened to be lucky that we were surrounded by ocean and only shared borders with a few countries, and all of the fighting was happening in, Europe and Asia. And so there is this kind of acknowledgement that the US does swoop in both wars to
Yeah.
suddenly save everyone. And it is kind of this funny thing where now that we've got the distance, we can be like, well, I mean, yes, but that's partially because the US wasn't fighting for as long, and we didn't have to worry about rebuilding society while also defending it. And so it is kind of interesting that we had that perspective. And John Wyndham is British, so he probably is like recognizing from the time this sense of relief when, the US finally did join, World War I, World War II. So yeah, but it was odd. It was weird for like how certain they're like, no, this wouldn't have happened in the US. And it might be related to the fact that, yeah, like the world wars didn't really touch the US in the same way to the same extent. So that, yeah, it was very weird. Also, around that same scene, I do want to say that it has nothing to do with it. And actually, I can't remember if it happened in this section or the one before, because at this point I don't know where the lines are. But how easily people can fly helicopters.
Yeah, it was
I
in
beg your
this
pardon.
section.
There's like a
'Cause I thought
random
the same
radio
thing.
engineer. Yeah, like this guy's like, "Oh, I started a radio business. I can fly a helicopter." And I was thinking, "No, you can't. You're gonna die." And then he does it without a hitch, and I'm like, something's wrong here, because and I feel like this reminds me of and I don't know how accurate this is. I've only, seen it on the internet, but there have been studies or jokes, people have been like interviewing men asking, "Hey, like if say there's some you're on a flight and something happens to the pilots, like do you think you could realistically get in there and like land the plane?" And there again, this could be inflated. It could be the internet, but for some reason I believe it, which might say in itself something. But all like a bunch of men, like most men will be like, "Oh yeah, no, I could totally land a plane." And it's like, "No, you couldn't. What are you talking about? Like, are you nuts?" So this whole idea of a guy just going on a helicopter, really casual, I'm like, that is absolutely absurd and terrifying. I think a helicopter is the most scary thing to try to fly without any preparation.
Well, and how many helicopters are there? Like, I'm like, where did you find a helicopter at? And they're talking about like the limitations of fuel and everything. And I'm pretty sure helicopters run on like jet fuel, which is not the same as regular fuel. So where are you getting the fuel for that? There's so many things that I know just in my ignorance because, I'm not living in a dystopian society and I don't have to know where all of those things are. I wouldn't have any clue of how to even start a helicopter. Like so some of that was definitely like, where's this headed? I did think that scene or those scenes when they were flying around the helicopters and seeing all the different smaller groups of people was very sad because as living in this society, if you do hear a helicopter with the thought process of, whether or not the Americans are going to come save us or just an entity will eventually be here to save us, I would think aircrafts would be something you would look for and say, like, if someone's flying an aircraft, they definitely have like the upper hand on society. And so I did understand they said that some people when they came out to visit them after landing in the helicopter, some people were even violent with them because of their dashed hopes that really this is just a group of random individuals flying a helicopter around instead of someone coming to save them.
Yeah, because and also, like you said, the helicopter in our day and age, when we're looking up, it seems as though it's a very official thing. We're not just seeing, at least I'm just assuming. I don't have the idea where, oh, that's just someone having a fun joyride. I'm thinking they're here in an official capacity doing something in the area. I don't know what they're doing. Maybe because I'm also thinking of like Mercy Flight, or of course, I also live quite near certain like military training bases and things. So I hear things is all I'll say. I don't know. So I wouldn't really be surprised to see that and think, okay, they're doing something really official. And yeah, if you're looking for rescue, looking to the skies makes sense. And the flood of emotions, people getting violent or becoming despondent once more, saying no. Actually, this is our reality. Just kidding. And also the different reactions too, as far as joining and choosing not to join, a larger group, is
Yeah.
fascinating, because it does make me wonder, what would I decide to do? Because I understand the immediate desire to say, okay, we have been struggling on our own. It would be really nice to be with a bigger group. Also, we're communal by nature as humans. So also the sense of loneliness that you get throughout the book, that almost being an additional fear of like what it could do to you, being so lonely and being so alone in this reality. But I also understand those who said, no, we're not going to join this group, not because they don't want to be controlled by, an entity or whatever, but there's also that fear of, well, if there's collapse here as well, what are we going to do now? I don't know. I kind of, I understand the fear of larger groups,
Yeah.
as well as the fear of staying alone with just a few other individuals. It seems like it would be a really tough, especially on top of that, when you don't know whose best interest this larger group organization has. Because there were good questions of saying, so do you vote for your council or is it self
Yeah.
appointed? What is the hierarchy? Are you going to, actually take care of everyone, or are you using humans as animals? Because we do see that other group, the militaristic group that follows that redheaded man that we saw earlier in the book, who shot a blind man who had fallen sick. So we do see that there is fear of a larger entity, and them abusing their power immediately.
Yeah. And actually, let's talk about their plan because that group comes on the scene. So we have like this almost peaceful reunion with Michael Beadley. So Michael Beadley shows up, and Susan ends up lighting a fire to allow Bill and Gisela to know that someone is there. And they come in, and Michael says that Coker is the reason that he ended up finding them, because he ended up joining Michael Beadley's group and told them where Bill could potentially be. And they were looking for someone with a biological background to try and come up with a scientific way of getting rid of Triffids, to try and take back the Earth from the Triffids. And so we have this moment, and they decide to give the individuals who are living in the homestead with them, it's their home. They decide to give them the summer to still live there and not travel to this larger community because, it's their home. Which I really appreciated their thought process of allowing those individuals to process, because as blind individuals, they talked about how scary it would be to just trust what people around you are saying, because they can't see the Triffids, they don't know what the dangers are to a certain extent. And so having and their entire lives upended to go to a community would be difficult. And so giving them time to process. And then the day after, we have these random military people show up that was led by the redhead, and they were just going to drop off a load of blind people on them and say, here, you're going to take care of these individuals. I thought that was very strange, because from it almost was like they took Coker's original idea of having sighted people take care of blind people and took it to an extreme. And they were treating human beings like animals. They even talked about feeding them cattle fodder, I think is what they called it. They were grinding up the Triffids, and because they didn't have enough resources to feed the people. And Bill spoke that worry. He was like, we don't have enough food here to feed the five of us who are here. How are we going to feed 20 more people? And they're like, oh, just grind up the Triffids and give it to them. They can't be how did they word it? It was like, they can't be beggars, can't be choosers, essentially, was the brief that they were saying. And it made me so mad because constantly Bill is talking about how this homestead isn't his, that he's not the person who owns this facility. It's actually Brent. It's Dennis Brent, I think was his name. And the redheaded guy was like, he's blind, he can't own anything. And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, like, what the heck?" But I didn't understand. I feel like that was very unrealistic to me, because a militaristic company, organization, or whatever, I feel they wouldn't be taking strides to save these people who they don't value as humans. That makes sense? Like, I feel like they wouldn't be going to different people and just dropping off blind individuals. I could absolutely see them coming to an institution or a homestead like Bill was living at and saying, "Okay, we are now taking over this facility because it's viable." But them taking people who are who they consider to be less than human, I don't feel like they would take the time to make sure those people survive.
Yeah, we do also we do get a glimpse that they had been doing this kind of from the beginning, that Coker had an idea, but he wasn't the only one who had the idea. So
Yeah.
that's his kind of discovery when he realizes there's another, gang. That's the way Bill describes it. That is majority blind people, and then there's one seeing who's directing and controlling them to, basically tell them what they need to do. And so then we're having, years and years later, it has become a bit of a militaristic regime. I think it's also social commentary on the fears of dictatorship, and then returning to this feudal system. There is some mention when Bill is questioning this idea, and the redhead in charge says, well, we're working towards this idea where eventually you will be a lord of your land, and you pay taxes to us for protection, to protect you and basically your labors. We're getting back to the not just like the feudal system, but also um back during slavery, right?
Yeah.
These, massive plantations that would have forced labor, bringing people down to not being viewed as citizens, not having rights, and not being able to own property. It's very reminiscent of that. In that Dennis no longer owns his property, even as Bill is emphasizing, no, he does. He is the owner. This is, a group of community where we all have our own responsibilities. And just because someone has a disability, that doesn't mean that they are lesser or cannot fulfill these, equal rights. So I liked that we had that moment, because it does demonstrate this fear where, if we're considering it, there would be, if anything, a group of people who would view that, who would say that. Even throughout the book, we have seen mentions of blind people not being as useful, having a harder time, having to be, retaught everything under the sun. And I feel as though this was a moment where, while there is some real acknowledgement of that because of the mass blinding event that it would cause this, issue of trying to like bring back normalcy just for an individual person who's blind, because they don't have the supports to actually be able to regain their own identity and mobility, their own agency. I do see Bill kind of growing throughout the story by the end, and him just like re-emphasizing, no, like I'm not the owner, I am not the all-powerful just because I happen to be able to see. So that was good. And I kind of I understand, maybe it was set up, maybe it was packaged in kind of this like very quasi way, but I suppose it feels weird to us because years and years have passed for them, whereas for us, we're like, whoa, this is, what are
That's
you?
true.
Yeah, whereas I guess if it's like 6, 7 years later, because when they I'm trying we haven't even talked about Susan, by the way, the
I
child
know.
that he ends up finding. And oh my gosh, that was a really like I'm glad we gained her, because that was a really
Yes.
lovely, it sounds weird to say that was a lovely reprieve, but I when she joined, I liked his interactions with her, rather than him just being lonely on the road and him saving her. But she is, I think she, how old is she? Is she maybe, I don't, how old was she when he ended up finding her? I know she had her brother Tommy, who was 4 years old.
I think she was 9, if I remember
Okay.
correctly, when they found her.
So she's 9 years old, and I think by the time that they have, settled in, had children, I mean, she is running the property. And she's, I know there
Yeah.
was a moment where they mentioned that she was 12, and I think it was a few years later. So we have had quite a bit of time pass. So I suppose it can kind of, it makes sense, but that just also, that still reflects poorly on the pacing, the narrative pacing, that it feels jarring to us because we weren't there for years, So I do see that it does feel a little bit weird that suddenly happened. And yeah, even though I'm glad for it, because it did provide a lot of important elements, but it was set up weird, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I do wanna talk about Susan and just get into her timeline just a little bit, because I think that was my favorite part of this section was him running into her, in his search for Jocelyn. He runs into this town that's been completely abandoned, or, like, people have just died in their homes, and, he runs into this young girl, and she's asking for help, and she wants him to see what's been done to her brother. I can't remember her brother's name.
Tommy, I
Was it
think.
Tommy? And so he goes and sees and realizes that Triffid has injured, well, killed this young boy, and she asks him if they're gonna bury him, and he said that that's the only person he buried throughout this, which I just thought that was it's a heartbreaking and also just crazy thing to think about that out of all the people he has seen die, this is the only person that he took the time to bury, which I'm glad that he did, but how heart-wrenching to, like, bury a little 4-year-old in their backyard. And yeah, and so that he takes Susan, kind of they eventually at the end say that they view Susan as their daughter because the militaristic people try and take her, which I was like, "Oh, I swear if that happens, I am gonna rage." And Susan kind of becomes, a helper on the homestead. She has to grow up. He has these discussions, which is one of the parts I found really interesting and meaningful as he's driving through towns with Susan to find Jocelyn. He doesn't pull his punches when he's describing these horrific things that have happened, and he has a discussion with himself about why he's being so blunt with her, and they are in a world where it's not going to be beneficial to lie to her about the facts of the world and why things are happening. And it was a very interesting thing to think about a child growing up in this dystopian society and the fact that they don't have the privilege of being protected from those really horrible things.
Yeah, and yeah, I think Susan is a great perspective to have in general, the eyes of a child, because throughout this book so far, we've only ever seen adults. There have been mentions when we've had characters grouped together, for instance, at the university or elsewhere, where they've mentioned, oh yeah, so maybe a husband and a wife and their children, but we've never actually spoken to a child, and it's the first time you acknowledge, wait a second, they're a child could be completely abandoned, and now they're in this world that they don't understand, because she and her brother did have two parents. They both ended up being blind, and there's also these very sad moments throughout the book where someone mentions, someone dear to them goes out to get help and it just never comes back. And then there's this question of, do we send another person out or what do we do? And this moment where she says, after their father never comes back, the mother goes out, returns sobbing, and just, who knows what she experienced out, in the world. And then, of course, being the mother, realizing she's got to take care of her children, what else can she do? She's going to go out again. And unfortunately, she doesn't come back. And now Susan is the sole provider for herself and for her younger brother. And even her saying, like, he 4 years old, I mean, he can't see it, he doesn't have, the same type of like self-awareness to be aware of, possible dangers. And it was quite sad. And the number of times she tries to reach his body and she can't, because of the Triffid that is, practically defending it and obviously trying to get her as well. So I felt so bad for her because of what a way. I mean, we have this moment earlier in the book where Bill is, contemplating the loss of a future life for this, young woman who had just
So
turned 18, who, ended up being this really pivotal character for us in that section. And she was only on page for a couple pages. So now we have a similar situation for an even younger, young child, a young girl who, has the same type of tragedy where he has to say, what can we provide her, because this is going to have to be a different type of way of growing up, and why should I shield her from this when in reality, like, this is the way her life is going to be. And to almost force upon her his, like, society, raised brain of, having to look away, you not being able to, like, almost digest this, and it being this horrendous thing. It actually would strengthen her for him to say, no, this is the way it is, and have her move forward knowing that, rather than him trying to hide it from her when it's there. I don't know. I think that makes sense. And I've seen a lot of discussions. I'm not a parent, so this is, again, not really coming from my own experiences, but a lot of people discuss that we do use fluffy language. We talk indirectly to children. In reality, it probably is actually more harmful, because it's leading to more questions and to
yeah.
them not really being able to either emotionally or mentally process something when they finally are experiencing it. And so for him to just tell her how it is, it did protect her, and it also made it a lot easier for them to discuss things because then she felt more comfortable asking questions. She,
Right.
throughout the entire experience of him taking her with him, she would ask a question and he would answer to the best of his ability. There was this really also see, this author can like write some really pivotal scenes because there's a moment where Susan is asking him questions about, I think, where they're going, how long it's taking, and he's having to answer, I don't know, I'm not sure. And then finally, when she asks him, I think he finally tells her that they're going to reach Josala, that he's trying to reach her, and she asks, oh, is she pretty? And he felt relief that he had a certain answer and he said yes. And it's just this kind of moment of a really great way of him, us looking into his character saying, oh, I really hate how many answers I actually don't have.
Yeah.
But this one I can answer with, an affirmative. And obviously that brings, Susan comfort. She's very sweet and likes the idea that we're going to this beautiful woman. She finds comfort in that, which is very cute. Meanwhile, he feels good that he can finally give her an answer. So yeah, I Susan was such a pivotal character in this section, mainly just because of how it made us look at the world a little bit differently.
Well, we do probably need to wrap up. And speaking of questions to answer, we have three of our own. So we need to talk about what our rating is for the book, well, who our favorite character was. Doesn't have to be necessarily from the section. It could be for the entire book or from the section, whatever you would prefer. And then instead of questions that we have for the remaining pages, because we're done, how about questions that you wish were answered?
I think I'm going to go backwards. So, questions that I still have that I might wish were answered were simply whether Bill and his group will, survive and, thrive on the island. How long will the island actually, end up running? And yeah, what is this world gonna look like? Will they be able to rid the world of Triffids? Will they ever find that answer for some type of natural defense or chemical defense? Because of course, I'm also thinking, well, whenever we try to, kill off some type of, invasive species, sometimes it ends up harming the natural environment around us or introducing different dangers. So I'm kind of like, I'm thinking about that type of environmental issue of how is this actually going to play out. And for my favorite character, I'm definitely I'm gonna highlight Susan because of how lovely she was in this section. Overall, I'm still not mad that we got to follow Bill. He was a great character to follow. I loved the way his brain worked and how contemplative he was, how much he learns from his interactions with other people. It was really nice to have him as our main character. And then for my rating, this is tough. I don't hold me to it because I might change it, to be completely honest. But at the moment, I still feel good about a 3.75, to be honest. I feel as though this book, for being written in the 1950s and for having such interesting discussions that we've had surrounding not only the characters, the events, but also the historical significance, how inspired he was by what's going on, and how I constantly was seeing future, for him, future movies, TV shows, books, and that were clearly, either stemming from this or stemming from other works that stemmed from this.
Yeah.
I have to respect it. I've got to respect this book for what it is. And it kind of being, a very early prototypical sci-fi dystopian of its time. Yeah, I mean, if John Wyndham was writing this book today, he probably would write it so different. But there are still so many scenes that I would have hoped he'd keep, right? Like, even though I have criticisms, there are so many scenes and so many lines that I would hope he keeps. So I'm going with a 3.75. How about you? What are your answers to these three questions?
I've been debating on my rating. It's definitely in the 3-star range because I do think that the progression of the storyline for me, because of the timeline and how many details I feel like we didn't get at the end, um, that's why it's not going to be in the 4 stars for me. So I think I'm settling at a 3.5. I think that there were some really pivotal scenes and, like as you said, really interesting conversations that those scenes led us to. But I just wanted a little bit more. And I think especially from the end to kind of see where they ended up, which I know we know that they go to Michael Beasley's group, but I would have liked to have seen them exist there for a little bit to see if they end up deciding to stay or if they are one of the people who go to the other island. I feel like it was pretty abrupt at the end. And then I also wanted more from the Triffids. Like I know that they were constantly a background object, but I do feel like the ending seemed very rushed, where they were just all of a sudden, coming out of the woodwork and surrounding the facility. But I think that that goes back to the timeline being years in these last couple of chapters, as opposed to days as we were getting before. My favorite character, I am going to go with Susan. I think that I just really liked her story is so heartbreaking and what she had to go through as a child. But her attitude as well, like about the whole thing. The fact that she refused to call the Triffids Triffids, she always called them things.
Mhm.
I just she added some very heartfelt, kind of funny moments in some really bleak times, and so I really appreciated her character. But I did like being in Bill's head throughout the whole thing. I liked his thought process and the way that he had to go through this society that he was not prepared for, and just having his thoughts throughout in whether or not he was making the correct decisions in these battles that he would go through. I appreciate that type of storytelling as well. And then questions, I guess I've already kind of asked them. As far as, I want to know, did they stay with Michael Beasley's group? Did they end up going to the other island? And yeah, it would be interesting to see if someone did like a response to this book. Obviously it's not going to be John Wyndham, but if somebody could do some type of a story on what happens with the Triffids after they discovered a chemical component to get rid of them, because it would be interesting to see how that impacts the rest of the natural world. Because I do think eventually, at least in my head, the Triffids seem to replicate and reproduce rather quickly, and inevitably they're going to end up running out of food, right? So to see it from that perspective, like if we don't find a chemical thing that's going to help us with them, would they eventually die out and become, a lot of overpopulation of animals? They will end up getting diseases and things that wipe them out because of the fact that the world that they're on can't support them. So I wonder if something would have happened like that. Those are questions in my head.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I had that same idea very quickly because, I mean, when we were reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone, part of that was to help with the deer elk populations, that when there's a bad winter and when there's not enough food to go around, rather than, these animals becoming prey to another predator, they simply were starving. And so I could definitely see that, where I was waiting to see if there would be like an overpopulation issue. There probably would be in the future. But that does close our discussion. A few things to note. One, I know there's at least one adaptation of The Day of the Triffids. So for those of you who got to the end who are interested to see how this could be adapted to film, maybe check it out. I'm pretty sure it's one of those like older from the 20th century, but I still really want to watch it because I want to see what these Triffids are going to look like from kind of in like old school design. I don't know how the graphics are going to be, or how, sophisticated it'll be, but I think it could be really fun. And also remember that we are now going to be moving on to our next book. We're going to be reading The Games Gods Play by Abigail Owen, continuing our season of genre blends. This one is going to be a romantasy, meaning that it's combining romance and fantasy. I'm 99% sure it's also a bit of a Greek retelling. I think we may have Hades and Persephone or something to that effect, but don't quote me because I'm trying to go in as blind as possible before we have our next introduction hype episode. Thank you all for listening, for hanging out with us all month, and we really do hope to see you next month when we're reading The Games Gods Play. All right, bye everybody.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Not Reading for Content. Be sure to check the description for a schedule of our upcoming reads for this season. For reminders and other updates, you can follow the podcast on Instagram at Not Reading for Content. Where else can the listeners find you, Leandra?
I have a booktube and an Instagram. My booktube is at Leandra the TBR0, and my Instagram is at Leandra _the TBR0. How about you, Danny?
I have the same platforms. Both can be found at danny.dabbles. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to tune in next Friday for our next episode.